Hi and welcome to Money Control. It's about half an hour to go for the budget. The Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has a tough act to follow. Everyone from the public to businessmen, they are all asking for tax cuts and rebates and exemptions because the economy is in a slowdown. At the same time, the Finance Minister has to keep the fiscal deficit under control. So what are the changes that we can expect in taxation today? To discuss that, we have Jinesh Shah, who is a partner at KPMG's tax practice. Hi, Jinesh.
Hi, how are you?
Jinesh, the fiscal deficit, it is very difficult to keep it under control. The total public sector borrowing requirement is close to 9% of GDP.
Yes.
At the same time, the government needs to do something to push growth. So what are the changes we can expect in taxation?
See, from a taxation perspective, if you look at it, the FM has a very difficult task at hand, because obviously if you compare the tax to GDP ratio that India has is close to about 10 to 11%, whereas in developed markets it is close to 30%. So obviously expecting tax cuts from the government, it will be difficult from the government side because we are anyway at a very low tax base. But having said that, the way the economy is structured, over the last 2 to 3 quarters, we are seeing recession signs coming up very clearly. So to push that, we will need to have significant amount of investment coming in, and therefore we hope there are some tax cuts. And probably for a year or so, we should not worry that much on the fiscal deficit part of it, but focus more on the growth. I think that is more important to start forward.
But what can the government do in terms of tweaking the corporate tax, for example? I mean, they had promised that they want to bring it down to a level of 25%. And India, if you look in the neighborhood, India has one of the highest rates of corporate tax.
Absolutely. So if you look at it, the corporate tax rate is close to 35%. And followed with a dividend distribution tax, which is another 20%. So if you take together, about 50% of a corporate's profits are going as tax to the government, whereas the global median is at about 29%. So clearly there is a big case for a corporate tax cut. Now whether that happens in the corporate tax rate or in the DDT, it's open for the FM to decide. But I think going by the standards, we should expect that rate to come down to 25%. We had promised a few years back. So I think that is going to be one of the important things to watch out for.
Do you think it will happen in this budget?
This budget, I don't think the whole thing can happen. What they had given was the 25% tax rate for companies having turnover of up to 250 crores. Probably they may increase the threshold. But I think over the period of next 3 to 5 years, we should be going towards 25%, as most of the tax concessions that we were having have been waived off.
Okay. What about angel tax? I mean, that is another thing which has been in the news for the past year, and the government has, Startup India program, etc. But this seems to be a major impediment.
Absolutely. As far as the angel tax was concerned, the government has been quite proactive. There were various representations made, etc., and they did come up with a policy where they carved out certain startups, from angel tax. Okay, but there is still some space to go on it. Whether we expect anything from this budget, I'm not sure whether they would be considering, because they just came up with a notification a few months back. But I think we'll wait for that notification and the actual things to evolve before expecting more from the government.
I mean, what can we expect there?
Typically what one could expect is, currently the conditions which are mentioned over there are quite stringent. Probably they may just give off conditions in terms of, whether a minimum tax should not be levied where the turnover is below a threshold of say 100 crores. The current threshold is too less. So probably, if the threshold is increased, it would be something which will be very useful for the startup ecosystem. Because for us, when you say Make in India, new startup technology companies, there's a significant amount of premium which comes into the companies. So probably, giving a blanket ban. There have been few instances in the past where the premium was not used very efficiently, but I think we should not paint the entire industry with the brush, probably give it more liberal view on that.
Is it more to do with complaints, inspections are there?
Absolutely. I think it's more important that you assume, the starting point is assuming that whatever premium has been received has been fair, and it's on the department to challenge it. Currently, the way the regulation is worded, it is on the recipient of the company to, justify that this was a fair value, etc. So I think that is something which should shift more focus on the department rather than the SSC itself over here.
Right. Don't you think it's time for a new direct tax code to come into place? There have been talks about it, but not much action on the ground.
Yeah, I think that is a very important point. If you look at it like GST, GST was something which they implemented it with a dedicated time plan. They gave a time plan and they really moved. The government did a fantastic job in terms of, moving ahead with the GST. Initially, there were some teething issues, but within a defined time frame, they achieved it. I think from a direct tax code perspective also, something similar would be expected. They did expand the, what you call as the comments that were expected and the horizon of the direct tax code. So we expect it probably in today's budget, we expect that the FM will lay down a roadmap with defined timelines. So once we have the timelines in place, then the entire ecosystem would work towards achieving the direct tax code within those timelines. And we expect quite a few things to be part of the direct tax code, and therefore not significant amendments coming up on the income tax part of it in today's budget.
In today's budget, right. What about the wealth tax? I mean, last week you must have read about a bunch of US billionaires writing an open letter saying, impose a wealth tax on us.
Yeah.
It has not had a great track record.
Absolutely.
But do you think the time is right?
So let's just put it two things. One is the wealth tax part of it, and second is the inheritance tax part of it. As far as the wealth tax was concerned, it was there in India for a very, very long period of time. It got abolished just a few years back. And one of the main reasons for abolishing it was the cost of collection of wealth tax was more than the actual wealth tax getting collected, because it was becoming very difficult to monitor it and also have an effective system. So when they did abolish the wealth tax, at that point of time, they levied a surcharge on the tax rate. And the collections from those is significantly more as compared to the wealth tax. So that is becoming more efficient. So to my mind, I think that surcharge is anyway taking care of the wealth tax which is there in place. So I don't think a new wealth tax coming into place there. However, having said that, inheritance tax, there is a lot of discussion, etc., which is going around whether inheritance tax should be introduced or not in India. If you look at it, few countries around the world definitely have inheritance tax. So you look at the large economies, etc., they have. But there are some economies, and most of those economies are more developed. Whereas in our situation, it is where we need people to create wealth for the next generation, etc., because India is still a growing economy. So I don't think time has right now come for inheritance tax. I don't expect the budget to levy any new taxes at this point of time, whether it is inheritance tax or wealth tax. I think probably we should wait for a few more years. Once the economy is really doing good, you have wealth already created, then reach to those matured levels.
But won't that exacerbate the inequalities which are already there?
In terms of how do you look at, making those equalities, there are different ways of doing it. Essentially, when you're taxing an individual, at 30% rate, or a corporate at a 35%, and which is going up to 50%, that is the surplus which the government is receiving it and which it is sharing with the poor. But at the same time, you need to have that incentive for people to create more wealth, because in a developed economy, that is something very different. Whereas in India, you need people to be incentivized, so to create more value for people.
Okay. I mean, we always tend to think of wealth and inheritance tax as flat tax. What about a progressive rate in those? Do you think that would be more acceptable?
The way it would typically come, or way it is there in most of the global economies, is as follows: is you have a basic threshold limit. Okay, that threshold limit could be significant when you compare to Indian standards. To typically be a house, it will be some basic amenity limit. It could be like a 5 crore or 10 crore limit, and above that, typically it's a flat rate, because that's the value of the asset which is moving out from one generation to the next generation. So probably it is normally a flat rate, which is what we have seen across various economies.
Okay. You think any changes in personal income tax?
As far as personal income tax are concerned, yes, people would be expecting an increase in the basic exemption or increase in the standard deduction limits. But I don't think so. The finance minister has the leverage to do it, because as I mentioned, our tax to GDP ratio is really at a very low level as compared to global standards. And we also need to expand the tax base. So although all of us would be wishing for it, but I doubt whether they can do it. But at least what they could probably consider is some of those allowances which are sitting out over there, whether you can increase it. Just to give you an example, say there is the children education allowance. So that is something which is 100 rupees per month per child. So this was something which was set up 20 years back. Now 100 rupees per month is virtually nothing. So either you can just skip it off the list, or at least make it something which is more reasonable, which makes more sense for individuals. Secondly, which could be more interesting is, for interest paid on housing loans. we have a limit of which is 1,50,000 per individual. Now that is something which is there but not significant. So if you turn it into a housing loan amount, it would be a 15 to 20 lakh housing loan. If you look at any of the metros across, I don't think we can ever buy a house for 15 to 20 lakh rupees. So increasing that would really make sense, because what it would do is it will create a positive virtuous cycle, the cycle which they were referring to in the economic survey yesterday. Because once that limit is increased, you will have people going out and looking at buying a house, because now you get a huge tax break on it. Okay, that improves demand from a real estate perspective. Having real estate and infra are the two largest employment sectors with gendered employment. So that will give a kickstart to employment. Housing loans will go up, which is typically a significant amount of positive loans which will go out.
Okay.
And that will lead to cash flows coming back to the real estate companies, reduce the NPAs, and then that will go back to the banks, improving their capitalization. So I think that is something, increasing the housing loan interest is something which would be a big positive.
Essentially minor tweaks.
Minor tweaks here and there, yeah, I think.
Thanks, Jinesh. So that's it from our expert. Expect no major changes in taxes in the current budget, but the finance minister could well, come up with a blueprint for a new direct tax code in today's budget. For more news and updates, stay logged on to moneycontrol.com. Thank you.